Good afternoon. I'm Cheng Li, Director and the Senior Fellow of the John L. Thornton China Center here at Brookings. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this very special event. As I stand here introducing our two speakers, really two legendary figures in American diplomacy, in my mind, I'm far away and long ago. The place is Shanghai, my birthplace. The date is February 21st, 1972. President Nixon and Mrs. Nixon, along with Dr. Kissinger and Winston Lord, who had meticulously prepared this historical visit, arriving in Shanghai that morning before heading to Beijing. That scene, which was reported in the Chinese media, both symbolically and substantively ended 2 decades of mutual animosity between China and the United States. The result was the formation of a strategic anti-Soviet alliance, which contributed to the enhancing the prospects for peace and stability in the world, and eventually led to the end of the Cold War. For me, a teenager then, and for many other Chinese who lived through the Cultural Revolution, the name of Henry Kissinger embodies wisdom, diplomacy, great sense of history, grand strategy, and most importantly, in the Chinese context, hope. The opening of China was not only a turning point in history, but also an event that profoundly changed our lives of millions of people. Today, we are at another historical crossroads where the United States is facing formidable geopolitical and diplomatic challenges, among the most consequential being the US-China bilateral relationship. It is an understatement to say that we're still in great need of wisdom, diplomacy, great sense of history, and grand strategy. And in these trying times, our words and actions should be driven by hope instead of fear. We are fortunate to have with us today 2 of America's most prominent diplomats who not only witness many historical dramas, but also are visionary strategic thinkers who can provide necessary historical context or insights at this challenging time. They can guide us to look back into history and share their insights and experience of working alongside the towering giant of American diplomacy, Dr. Henry Kissinger, especially learning from Kissinger's approach to dealing with foreign leaders and an ever-changing world. In Ambassador Winston Lord's words, I quote, "The art of leadership, negotiation, and the making of foreign policy." Our 2 speakers certainly do not need an introduction. Yet, I would still like to say a few words about each of them very quickly. The author of the new book, Kissinger on Kissinger, Ambassador Winston Lord, was given the nickname Kissinger's Kissinger, and during his time serving as Dr. Kissinger's special assistant in the Nixon administration. He has also served as the director of the State Department Policy Planning Staff, president of the Council on Foreign Relations, ambassador to China, and assistant secretary of state in the Clinton administration. In addition to his renowned deep understanding and appreciation of Chinese culture, Ambassador Lord has a strong reputation for advocating for intellectual freedom, civil society, and universal values. Ambassador Lord, we are so honored to have you with us this afternoon at Brookings. My good friend, colleague, and mentor, Strobe Talbott, will moderate today's discussion. Talbott served as the president of the Brookings Institution for 15 years, from 2002 to 2017. And he was the person who hired me at Brookings 14 years ago. A Rhodes Scholar, a former correspondent for Time magazine, a renowned expert on both India and Russia, a distinguished diplomat who served as Deputy Secretary of State, and an instrumental leader of both Yale Center for the Study of Globalization and Brookings. Strobe surely has had a storied career. During the advance trip to Beijing by Dr. Kissinger and Ambassador Lord, Strobe was in the flying press corps covering them. We are honored to have Strobe to lead today's conversation. After their fireside chat, they will open to audience questions. Ambassador Lord has also kindly agreed to sign books following the event in our lobby. Ladies and gentlemen, with my personal gratitude and admiration, I would like to ask you to join me in giving our two wonderful speakers a warm round of applause.
Thanks, John. Win, I can already see that this auditorium has a number of your friends and your colleagues, and I am very, very proud to be in both of those categories. Let's start with the origin of this very, very small book that has grappled with very, very big issues and events and persons. Over to you.
Thank you, Strobe and Chung Lee. First, a few grace notes. There are many friends and colleagues who have worked with me in all my stages of my career, so I'm pleased to have them here. They've all agreed to laugh at my jokes and to ask some softball questions. But certainly, I'm very happy to see them here as well as family members. If you detect a real friendship among the three of us here, it can be well documented. First, let me say my respect for Chung Lee, one of the top China watchers in the United States. And don't take my word for it. He may not want me to say this, but I know he meets regularly with a guy named Kissinger on China affairs. So what higher accolade than that? And then Strobe and I have intersected twice, really, in addition to our general friendship. One when he was covering Kissinger and Nixon, and the other one we were both in the State Department together. I want to make clear I hold no grudge against you, Strobe, for beating me out as Deputy Secretary of State. It's true. Warren Christopher was down to two choices, and he correctly chose Strobe over me, but I've never really resented that. I want to make that clear. Now I'll get into the origins of the book, but let me just say what a distinguished career he's had in 4 fields: journalist, diplomat, think tank leader, and author of books, including a new one coming out next year. On the book, first I want to say we want to try to boost sales a little bit, so I've been talking to our publisher, and we're thinking of changing the title. I got this idea from Tom Brokaw, an old friend. We put out a press release a few months ago about the book coming out. He saw it on his very small iPhone. He saw the title of the book, but unfortunately the last 2 letters of the title got erased. He couldn't see it, so he went out, got 100 copies, thought he was buying the book Kissinger on Kissing. So we're thinking maybe of changing the title to boost sales. Now, to get to the origins of the book, Henry had never done an oral history, believe it or not. Here he was in his early 90s. A few years ago, I and another colleague conducted a series of videotape panels on Nixon foreign policy initiatives. The 4 in this book, Vietnam, China, Russia, and the Middle East. And it was more like timeline with some of the key participants. At the end of it, I thought, wouldn't it be good to get Henry to reflect almost a half-century later on the strategic environment and what he was up to. He'd never done an oral history, so I sort of had to talk him into it. The first one went so well, he agreed to keep going. To make a long story short, we took these 6 interviews over many hours, turned them into a transcript which forms the essence of the book, not only on those 4 issues, where he remarkably, in his early 90s, after 50 years, remembers not only strategic directions, but tactical milestones and anecdotes that were both revealing and amusing. But we drew him out in other issues like leadership, strategy, negotiations, organization of foreign policy, and so on. So I think the book, in addition to being very manageable, you say it's a little book. In fact, I've always said to Henry, he and Mao have one thing in common. Namely, they have both produced little red books. So we wanted to make sure it was a little white book and not a little red book. But I do think it's, for many of the younger generations, these events are ancient history. For those of us more familiar and older generations, it's a nice way to get back into that era, as well as the generic subjects I mentioned go beyond any decade. And it's a lot more accessible than a 1,000-page memoir. But above all, I think it'd be useful not only to future historians, but I would argue future practitioners of foreign policy. So that's the origin and the targets of the book.
Well, that's a good for me to say to you that I've had a little bit of time with Henry. Even in the press corps, we called him Henry. And you have said, and I guess with Chung, that what we're talking about today is what it's like in the orbit of Kissinger himself. And I can just imagine that the gravity in that orbit would be pretty intense. What was it like to work with that man?
I do have in the introduction forward to the book a snapshot of Henry, a personal portrait, which tries to capture some of his personality. I have to express at the outset my utmost respect, affection, and gratitude for having worked with him. But he was also a pain in the neck. So I label it the agony and the ecstasy, and I'll illustrate in a serious way how it was like to work for him. The toughest thing to do for him was speech writing. Among my other duties, I was fortunate to be involved in all the issues we talked about. I was the one person on the staff that was paired with the experts, and I was in there to help Henry with the global perspective of how it all fit together. But I also had the unfortunate task of writing speeches for him. So it would go somewhat like this. He would call me into an office, give me a topic, I'd do a first draft and give it to him. And a couple of days later, he'd call me into his office and he'd say, "Winston, is this the best you can do?" And I said, "I thought so, Henry. Let me take another crack at it." I go back, do a second draft, I go in. He says, "Are you sure this is the best you can do?" And I said, "Henry, I thought so, but I'll keep trying." Well, anyway, this goes on for about 6 drafts, and I'm really getting quite annoyed. So I go in there in the 6th draft, and of course, he asked the same question. So I said, "Henry, look, I've tweaked every paragraph. I've looked at every colon and semicolon. I cannot improve this any further. This is the best I can do." So he turned to me and with a smile and said, "In that case, now I'll read it." Now, he was someone to drive you very hard, although he would select your strengths. He knew I could write pretty well, so he would push me on that. If someone else couldn't write, but they were good on research and negotiations, he would push them on that. So he stretched my patience, he stretched my nerves, but he also stretched my capabilities and my horizons, and I'll always be grateful. There's no question that he would sometimes lose his temper and get mad and yell at his staff. But the interesting thing was, it would be over small things, not big things. So when the Yom Kippur War broke out in October '73, we were in his suite at the Waldorf Astoria for the UN General Assembly. And in the midst of calling the president, the foreign minister, the prime ministers of these countries, in this chaos, here he was polishing a UN speech very coolly in the midst of the crisis. On the other hand, if his assistant had too big a schedule for him, he'd say, "What am I, a dentist?" You know, and he'd get really upset. And one other example of what you would think would be a small thing he got upset about, on the secret trip to China in July '71, which we went to see whether we could set up Nixon's trip the year later. By the way, I have to segue here and say, as most of you know, I was the first person into China after 22 years. We cut off relations in 1949, and no American official had been there for 22 years. So a lot of people think Kissinger was first, but that's not true. We were on a Pakistani plane, Pakistanis up front, we and the Chinese in the back. And as we got close to the Chinese border, I went to the front of the plane, left Henry in the back, and I got there first. He of course, elbowed me and got off the plane first, but he got upset because his staff assistant didn't pack any shirts. And he wasn't worried about negotiating with Zhou Enlai or the fact that K2 was out our window and we were on a James Bond mission. No. He had no shirts. I, of course, said to Henry, you haven't started negotiating with the Chinese yet. You've already lost your shirt. So he borrowed one from another assistant, a very important man in this role, who's passed away, unfortunately, John Holdridge, who was about 6'3", and Henry went around looking like a penguin. And the shirt had a label that said, "Made in Taiwan." So my point is, on a crisis, he would keep you cool, he would be cool himself, but he could get impatient. And yes, he did beat up on the staff. He certainly demanded excellence. But one thing I'd really admired about him, he detested yes men and yes women. The first year I was on the NSC in '69, I was not in the West Wing. I was sitting over in what's now called the Eisenhower Building, helping to run the NSC system, but also sending him occasional memos, sort of a mini policy planning staff on issues coming up or what we ought to be doing differently. And several of them were critical. Henry hired me in February '70, not despite those memos, but because of them. He wanted people to argue with him as long as it was not mushy sentimentality and it was well and logically presented. So I'll always be grateful. We've shared some tremendous emotional moments. He himself has said that just about the highest emotional moment of his career and his life was when we made a breakthrough in October '72 in the Vietnam negotiations after 3 or 4 years, and after I'd almost quit 2 years later. He said, what do you want to do, try to make peace or go around waving a placard? So when that breakthrough came, we were in the garden and we shook hands and we said we did it. And for Henry, that's always been, and for me as well, one of the emotional highlights. So look, nobody's perfect. He has his flaws, but this is a remarkable person. And not only what he did while I was in office, but the fact he's still having such a major impact in his mid-90s, 50 years later.
Let's take another couple of extraordinary figures. Nixon, and also Ford, and Mao and Zhou and Deng Xiaoping. Could you just put a kind of a thumbnail sketch on each of those?
Yeah, we got how many hours we got? I mean, it really is going to be tough to condense that, but yeah, the answer is yes. First, Nixon. I've worked for 7 presidents of both parties. I'm a flaming centrist, bipartisan. I say with total objectivity, he was by far the most brilliant on foreign policy, incredibly well-versed, incredibly strategic in his thinking. That's what linked him with Kissinger, whom he had never met before I hired him. And after all, Nixon, we all know the dark side, so I'm not going to deny that or excuse it. But here he was, a conservative anti-communist from California, slightly anti-Semitic, distrustful of the East Coast and Ivy League colleges. Who does he hire as his national security advisor who he'd never met? A Jewish immigrant who worked for Nelson Rockefeller for several years, so from Harvard. So who did he pick on the domestic side? Patrick Moynihan. His record in domestic policy, by the way, holds up not only well by itself, but compared to other presidents we could name. So it was a real tragedy that he was removed from office. I think he deserved to be removed from office. I think it's trivial compared to what we're seeing today, but that's another issue. But the shame is that he was poised for a tremendous second term, not only his landslide election, but after inheriting an incredible landscape, which we can discuss about in '69, we opened up with 1/5 of the world's people, détente with the Soviets, ended the Vietnam War, we thought on a credible basis, began process of peace in the Middle East, his domestic achievements, and then it was all down the drain. So it's a real tragedy, but I really will always admire his strategic approach. And whatever his demons, and he had demons and paranoia, he always put the national interest first. So when we were moving toward an agreement, he kept cautioning Kissinger not to make a deal that really wasn't solid. He would not make a deal to help himself get reelected. He wanted to do the national interest, and I think he was sincere in that. Ford was obviously different. He didn't pretend to have the strategic approach or the grasp of foreign policy of Nixon, and therefore he delegated this essentially to Henry and backed him up beautifully and had a good deal of courage. When he was being challenged by Reagan in the '76 primaries, he encouraged and backed Henry when Henry undertook one of his most remarkable achievements that people forget about, Southern African diplomacy. It's not in the book because it was in the Ford administration, in which we brought the principle of majority rule in Southern Africa to the fore of American diplomacy, a pirouette on our policy, and promoted the independence of Rhodesia and Namibia. It was a remarkable achievement, but it cost Ford in the primaries in conservative states like Texas because they didn't like the fact we were doing this enlightened majority rule in Southern Africa approach. In fact, we got off the plane in West Africa in the middle of this, and the Texas primary had just gone to Reagan over Ford and probably over this issue. It was that close. So the press corps, I don't think including you, serenaded it as we got off the plane, Air Force One, the eyes of Texas are upon you, and so on. So he was a courageous man. Of course, he killed his career by pardoning Nixon, which I think was the right thing to do, but he knew that would defeat him. I do fault him for dropping Nelson Rockefeller under right-wing pressure and essentially keeping Kissinger away from his convention. So the man had flaws. I have to do one other incident to demonstrate that he was a very decent man, and I think he did a great service to the country by healing it. But I wouldn't say he was the quickest on his feet. I'll give you an example. We were with Chairman Mao. I hate to drop meetings, but this is the 5th meeting with Mao, and he was really sick at this point. And this was in 1975. So as Ford comes in, Chairman Mao says, "I will soon receive an invitation from God." Ford looks a little puzzled about that. At the end of the meeting, he's going out, shakes the chairman's hand, said, "Thank you, Mr. Chairman, it was a great meeting. And I want you to know that I really hope you get that invitation from God very soon." I think the translator said the president wishes you 10,000 years or something. He was a good translator. Anyway, a good man, but obviously totally different, and it was really Kissinger's foreign policy. And I think Kissinger's greatest single achievement, there's nothing in this book, but the fact that after Watergate, with the erosion of executive authority and American credibility, with the resurgence of congressional tactical oversight, and the loss of American prestige around the world, that he kept the China and Soviet initiatives alive. We couldn't really advance them greatly, but they didn't collapse. Went further in the Middle East with 2 more shuttles and did the Southern African strategy and laid out the agenda on issues like energy, law of the sea, North-South relations. So to hold the country together is the one America that was highly respected around the world and at home was really quite an achievement. It's forgotten today because he's very controversial, Henry. There's no question about it. And he has his flaws, as I said. But I would always remember that contribution. Now, I hate to give such a long answer. I've got to keep going here, right?
Please.
Okay.
By the way, we're going to open up the conversation after this.
Okay. And we can discuss any issues. It doesn't have to be China. It can be any, and it can be current issues or past issues. So I got to do the other 3. Okay. Mao, let's remember now, Mao vies with Hitler and Stalin for the gold medal of horrible dictators in the 20th century. So that's the background to all of this. We felt we had to open up.
He had his flaws.
He had his flaws. The cliche is, you see someone and you know they're a great historical figure, and therefore that's why you're drawn to them. But in fact, he's the kind of person, we walk in the room, you just felt this, however sick, even in his first meeting with us, he was, that this man was a powerful person. He was not elegant. I'll get to Zhou Enlai as a contrast. He spoke in brushstrokes. In fact, in the meeting with Nixon, which I was at, it was cut out of, as you may know, the proof that I was there is in the book, and I won't go into the story now. It's in the book. But when Henry and I came out of the meeting, we were a little disappointed because Mao kept saying he didn't want to get into substance, which Nixon wanted to, and kept saying, talk to Zhou Enlai about this. But what he did, we realized in the next few days as we negotiated with Zhou Enlai that he had really set the strategic framework for the key issues. So whether it was Taiwan or the Soviets or Indochina, he said enough to give Zhou Enlai the framework to work with. Mao, not only just in this meeting, but all his meetings, would use allusions and symbols. And you either thought he was brilliant, you were stupid because you couldn't figure out what he was saying, or maybe the guy was senile, you know. I think it was usually the former. I mean, for example, he used the phrase empty cannons when he talked about Chinese anti-American propaganda. He said, that's just an empty cannon. We just do that for show. The Soviets were the polar bear, you know. Watergate was nothing. He referred to it as breaking wind. He said, so these are the kind of things. Finally, the other illusion was one I've already mentioned with Ford, I'm going to get an invitation from God. So that's the way he would operate. Now, sometimes we did have trouble figuring him out. On one meeting, I think it was the third one with just Kissinger, he said, I want to send 10 million Chinese women to the United States. Now, we didn't know what the hell he was talking about. Just because Henry Kissinger was supposed to be a secret swinger, I don't know what it was. So we couldn't figure it out. I get home and I talk to my Shanghai-born Chinese wife who knows China better than anyone. She immediately said, no, he's having trouble with his wife, Madame Mao, politically. And she was right, of course, the Gang of Four and Madame Mao. So it took one Chinese to figure out the other. But anyway, he was very subtle, even as he was very brutal. Zhou Enlai, of course, was a complete contrast. Elegant Mandarin, elegant presentations, very well briefed. He never had any notes or briefing books, and therefore Nixon didn't either because he didn't want to be one-upped. But by the way, Nixon prepared for this visit more carefully than any president I've ever seen. He went through 6 briefing books I put together for him with, obviously, the government's help. And every page was marked up, and as we flew over to China, he kept coming back in Air Force One and asking us for more information, and so on. But in this meeting, he didn't want to have notes because Joe didn't have notes. So Joe would, Henry has said he's the most impressive diplomat he's ever met. I would, of course, echo that, although he had his ruthless quality, too. You don't get to be where he did doing it. But he also did not damage limitation, of course, of Mao's excesses. In addition to presenting the Chinese position very beautifully and firmly, but also in a way you could negotiate, and with great historical contrast, he had tremendous charisma. It's an overused word, but he was the kind of person that just was so attractive. And he used gestures very effectively. For example, one of our party got sick on one trip. He sent his personal doctor over. And one of the more memorable gestures he made was on a trip we made. Kissinger and Zhou Enlai had just finished a long discussion. By the way, at a previous discussion, Zhou Enlai showed both his long view and his one-upsmanship because Henry asked him, they had finished, and so they'd love to talk about history and philosophy. So Henry asked him, Mr. Prime Minister, what do you think the impact of the French Revolution was? And Zhou Enlai replied, it's too soon to tell. So that's the kind of guy he was. Now, the last incident with Joe was we'd finished our last meeting with him, and in an extraordinary gesture, he offered to walk Henry back to the guest house. Now, the backdrop to this, for the previous 3 days, Henry and I often go outside the guest house, which we knew was bugged, in order to discuss tactics. The trees were probably bugged too, but so we would go out there. But every time we got to a certain bridge, as we walked around the grounds, the PLA guy would pop up and stop us from crossing. We couldn't figure this out. Of course, we talked about it in the guest house. So after this final meeting, Zhou Enlai says, look, I'll walk you home. He walks Henry home. He doesn't make any reference to anything, but where does he walk us? Over that bridge. So this is the kind of guy he was. He was remarkable. And the one poignant point I will make about him, though, and it's really sad, and I guess this is the way he survived, but and comes from Mao's doctors, so we're not making this up. In 75 and 76, both Mao and Zhou were very sick and clearly going to be dying. Mao wanted to make sure he outlasted Zhou because he wanted to make sure the succession went probably with the Gang of Four, and Zhou was leaning toward Deng Xiaoping and so on. Zhou had cancer and he needed an operation. Mao forbade the operation. Now, I don't know whether it would have saved Zhou's life or not. He probably would have passed away anyway. But Zhou knew that Mao had stopped him from having an operation, which he needed. What did Zhou say as he went for the final passage of his life? Long live Chairman Mao. It's really rather sad. But there is still a debate whether he prevented much greater damage or whether he was an enabler. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? I go with the view that he had to do some of this stuff in order to survive. In all the meetings with Mao, Zhou, who's so dominant in his own meetings, was not only deferential in Mao's presence, but almost obsequious. Then very quickly on Deng Xiaoping, totally different, very small. His feet wouldn't much touch the ground. Constant smoker, spit in the spittoon all the time. Totally unconventional. Very positive on U.S.-China relations and on the opening to the world and reforms, as you would expect. And we would often go to China, or when I was there as ambassador, and the early parts of visiting officials' trips would be pretty tough, but Deng would end it on a positive note. I think the verdict on him will go down extremely mixed. On the one hand, his opening of China, the reforms, the incredible economic performance ever since, he deserves tremendous credit. On the other hand, on the political side, he was ruthless. He was the front man for Mao in the 1950s, the anti-rightist movement. When Wei Jingsheng, Democracy Wall, helped him get into power after Mao's death, he immediately imprisoned him. He sacked two party secretaries who were too liberal for him, Zhao Ziyang and Hu Zhebang. And then, of course, he was responsible for the Tiananmen massacre. So I have very mixed feelings about him.
And I don't think Henry ever had real good chemistry with him.
With Deng?
Yeah.
Well, not like Zhou, because Zhou was so much more of a strategic and historical thinker like Henry, and they bonded that way. But it was pretty good chemistry. It wasn't, it certainly wasn't tense, but nothing could match the Zhou-Kissinger conversations. I think are historic in every way.
Okay. Sir.
Thank you, Strobe. Thank you.
There's a microphone. You ended your talk a little early. They weren't quick.
Yeah, you should feel free to ask some more questions too if you want. Yeah.
While we get
We did one.
while we get the mics, one of the things that a number of things that I've found in the book was particularly interesting to me, and that is that your the government, our government's Russia or Soviet experts were very worried about moving over and opening to China. And you say in the book that it was absolutely the opposite.
Yes. When Nixon and Kissinger came into office, the East wanted to reach out to China. Nixon's emphasis was somewhat more on world order. You can't leave a quarter of the world's people outside angry and so on. So he was thinking of a sort of global structure. Henry was thinking more balance of power, playing them off in triangular diplomacy against Moscow's. But they had the same view coming in. 1 week after Nixon's, I'm going to get to your question, 1 week after Nixon's inauguration, he sent a memo to Henry, said, get in touch with the Chinese. That's how high the priority was. There was a series of public signals we sent to condition various audiences, even as we tried to get in touch with the Chinese secretly. It's all in the book. But the point is, there was enough out there so that smart people like the Soviet scholars you're talking about, scholars on the Soviet Union, picked up the direction Nixon was heading. No one at that point could predict it would be so dramatic as the secret trip. And so George Kennan, I may get these names all four on, but it's George Kennan, Foy Kohler, Tommy Thompson, Chip Bolin, all cautioned Nixon, who they knew his overwhelming priority when he came in was to settle down the Soviet-U.S. tensions in a nuclear standoff, said to him, if you open up a China, you're going to really mess up relations with Moscow. Nixon and Kissinger didn't agree with that. Here's what happened. We, in the first couple of years while we were trying to get in touch with the Chinese, we had real negotiations with the Soviets that weren't really going very well, and there was a couple of crises, Middle East, Cuba, and so on. And Nixon wanted a summit with the Soviets, and they kept turning him down, figuring they had him looking eager. So as we finally got to the point where we were going to China to set up a summit with the Chinese, we gave the Soviets, who did not know where this was happening, one last chance to have the summit first. And I got a call from Al Haig, Kissinger's deputy, on the way to Pakistan. We were on a public trip at that point. And he said over the phone, in code language that wouldn't fool my 4-year-old grandson, said that they've turned us down again on a summit. So therefore, we decided to go with China first. To get to your point about the impact and the Soviet scholars' advice, we get to China. Within days of the announcement of Henry's trip and the president's forthcoming trip, the Soviets rushed out to San Clemente and asked for a summit. We made progress on a Berlin Agreement. We made major progress in arms control. And this all happened within a matter of weeks. So I think it's fair to say what Nixon and Kissinger were trying to do is not mess up Soviet relations. They're trying to improve it by getting their attention, which they obviously did, which gets into the whole issue of strategy and triangular diplomacy.
Right. Sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Lord, for writing this great book. Strobe, thank you for acknowledging me for a question. Strobe is also my former boss.
A little louder, I think.
Can you hear me now? Oh, thank you. I was thanking Ambassador Lord for writing this great book and thanking Strobe, my former boss, for acknowledging me for a question. Ambassador Lord, right on the first page of Chapter 1, you open with a quote which stuck with me as I read the book. And the quote was, a core principle of the president, speaking of Nixon, was that since you pay the same price for half measures, you should adopt bold moves. I think we certainly saw that with China. We saw that with Rhodesia, as you mentioned, and with the Soviet Union. What's missing in the book is Kissinger and Cuba. And I wonder how you take this quote and what you guys did on Cuba and talk to the group about that, holding this quote up to what you did with respect to Cuba.
Well, if he thinks that something makes sense, he says you go ahead fully and you take your chances because you're going to pay as much of a price for half measures and you may not succeed. I've never remember him even talking about Cuba. It's interesting at that point. We're now talking only a few years after the Cuban Missile Crisis and so on. So it's a question I've never gotten before, to be honest. It just never came up. Now, I can only surmise that he felt he could take on only so many dramatic initiatives at one point, and that he was going to have enough trouble with his base and his anti-communist, pro-Taiwan people on the opening of China, and enough trouble from the right on détente with the Soviets, not to mention the controversy of ending any war in Southeast Asia like the one we were engaged in, not to mention the Israeli-Arab tightrope in the Middle East. So I think he undoubtedly felt this was not as high a priority. You had a nuclear weapons standoff with a major power, you had a quarter of the world's people, you had a war you had to get out of, and you had the importance of the Middle East. So I think it was a matter of priority. So this never came up.
I'm going to go to the lady there. Right, but did you put your hand up? No, okay. And please feel free to ask about today's world and our foreign policy.
Thank you for your introduction, your new book. I'm a student from Georgetown University, and my question is that according to your understanding of the Kissinger's grand strategy, in your opinion, what should the U.S. government do face the rising China, and what should U.S. do to face the upgrading trade conflicts with China? Thank you.
I'm afraid I just didn't understand the question.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay.
Slow down a little bit.
Okay. According to the Kissinger's grand strategy, your book, in your opinion, what U.S. should do face the rising China, and what should U.S. do to face with the upgrading trade conflicts with China?
Okay, so basically, trying to apply Kissinger's strategic approach, how do you think I, or perhaps him, but in this case it have to be me, would approach the China-U.S. relationship today? And then you said specifically the trade part? Yes. Okay, I just want to make sure I have it right. It's a good question. The quick answer is the following. First of all, we're at the most serious juncture in U.S.-China relations, certainly since Tiananmen, maybe since the very opening. Part of that is structural. Rising power versus an established power, you're going to have tensions no matter what, particularly if you have ideological and some other differences between them. So it's going to happen no matter who's leading or what's happening. So you got that general background. Previous crises occurred usually over one issue: planes colliding, bombing the wrong embassy, Taiwan, and at a time when China was much weaker than they are today, of course. So those crises were by no means as serious, and they were fairly quickly resolved compared to what we now face, which is a major problem. Let me say that I'm not saying the United States is totally blameless and China is totally at fault, but I will say that the current crisis is primarily China's fault, and it would have happened whether Trump was president or not. Since 2008, and I say this as someone who has worked for 50 years for this relationship and will continue to do so and hope we can stabilize the relationship. And I'm going to reject the dragon slayers as much as I reject the panda huggers. And I'll get back to that in just a minute. I'm down the middle on this. But I think we have to acknowledge that since roughly 2008, the Chinese turn in domestic and foreign policy has been very ominous. And you don't have to talk to me. You talk to think tank scholars all across this country, former government officials. There's a unanimous opinion. There's a different opinion of what you do about it. But I think everyone would say there's been a sharp turn, particularly under Xi, that has brought this crisis about. Doesn't mean we're not blameless. And I'm going to try to make this a shorter answer so we get more questions, but it's a big question. Very quickly, stepped up repression at home, censorship, what they're doing to religious minorities, the horrors in Xinjiang, the destroying of any institutional restraints in China, dictator for life, Communist Party being inserted everywhere, going backwards on economic reforms, violating WTO agreements. That's just on the domestic side. Then you get mercantilistic, protectionist policies on economics. You get intellectual property theft. You get cyber warfare. You get militarization of the South China Sea, provocations in the East China Sea, squeezing Taiwan, squeezing Hong Kong, promoting influence in other countries, not just the US, but Australia, New Zealand, and many others. That is not only just legitimate public diplomacy, but sometimes covert and corrupt and has to be opposed. So that's what's brought about this problem. And it dates to 2008, where the financial crisis, where the US fell on its face. China looked pretty good. China was stronger, felt a sense of hubris, and had the coming out party of the Olympics. And so ever since then, they've been much more aggressive abroad and repressive at home. I say that as recognizing their legitimate claims to a greater share of the world's power and respect, and that we should not make them an enemy. Now, having said that, there are two distinct responses to this to get to your question, what we ought to do, that I think are both wrong, and I've alluded to them. One are those who feel, and many of my friends I highly respect, but basically feel that the current problem is essentially both sides. We both have been screwing up, not primarily China like I think it is. And that we don't really have to change our policy. That engagement, which I supported, should be continued, but we've got to look after our own sins as well as China. I dismiss that group. I think it's too weak a response to China when they are the culprit. The other side is even worse, because I'm closer to this group than the other side would make China a permanent enemy, inevitable enemy. We try to decouple, try to contain, all of which are impossible, and I call them the dragon slayers. My view is in between, namely we have to toughen up our policy in certain areas to respond to Chinese aggression and repression, but that we should also continue to look for areas we can cooperate, most of which Trump has destroyed. Final point I'd make, so I think we ought to look at it, as I did with many other colleagues in a task force report called Course Correction. So to go to Asia Society, Course Correction, you can get this report, which goes down the middle, as I've suggested, namely, manage the conflicts that we can't solve, still seek cooperation where we can, get a little firmer, but don't turn them into enemies, don't overreact against Chinese citizens, have a McCarthy-like period, and so on. Be selective in your surveillance of what's going on here in our own society. So I think we ought to look at it as a competition. It is a strategic competition. It doesn't mean enmity. And we ought to welcome it, because we have assets compared to China that I think are very favorable to us. And if we can get our act together, we can compete. China's got 14 neighbors, all of whom have either had border clashes, territorial disputes, they harbor terrorists, they have nuclear weapons. We've got Mexico and Canada and 2 oceans. We've got an energy independence almost. We've got better universities, a better entrepreneurial system, a better political system if we don't screw it up. Better demographics, immigration if we don't screw it up. So we have tremendous, they've got a debt problem, an aging population, pollution, energy problems, a terrible water problem coming up. I could go on and on forever. So we ought to welcome the competition, but Trump is at least deserves credit for helping to raise the consciousness of the competitive nature of our relationship. But he's responding in just the wrong way, because of the 3 principal areas we need to compete with China, he's messing up. One is our domestic strength. This is true of foreign policy in general, not just China. Get our act together, not only the terrible political polarization and the invective and so on and distrust, but also investing in our future, whether it's infrastructure, energy, education, so that we can compete with China, build on our strengths, above all our demographic and immigration strengths, and so many other things that are being destroyed. And we're hardly projecting ourselves as a city on a hill in terms of our soft power and our democratic ideals. So the domestic strength is the basis of China foreign policy toward China. Secondly, working with allies. What are we doing? Picking fights and trade disputes with allies when we ought to all gang up on China, because they've all got problems with China's economic position. Just in general, we pull out of a Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was terrific economically and geopolitically against China. And so we're messing up under this administration and working with other friends and allies. And when you have love letters from dictators and you pick fights with your democratic leaders, it's just upside down, genuinely and generally, but also with China. And then finally, use international institutions to magnify our inherent strengths. We can lead now, but it's more like galvanizing coalitions rather than dominating. And so when you pull out of the Iran deal, the climate change, or the trade pacts in Asia, you're also not helping your policy toward China. So credit for recognizing the threat, but a very poor reaction in terms of policy with the current administration.
That was a long list of nasties. There's one more, at least I've heard of it, and it's in the papers, and that is the Chinese are going to see if they can do what the Russians did to our last election in next year. That they're going to try to hack into our election.
Well, they will certainly do that in the Taiwan elections in January. They're already doing that there. They're certainly capable of it technologically, as is Iran. It's not just the Soviets. I'm not so sure they'll try to fool around in our election.
And they probably don't want to hurt Trump's rival, whoever it is, because
well, you know, I think they're ambivalent about who they want to win. Maybe one reason they may not interfere. I think they may not because they figure they get caught. Not that they're totally shameless, but I think I don't know. I don't want to be naive. They might well interfere. Certainly, the Russians are already trying again. They have the capability, and they're certainly doing it in Taiwan. So they may well do it here. But I'm not so sure they wouldn't want Trump to win. On the one hand, they can't stand his unpredictability and his seat of the pants and his occasional insults. On the other hand, they must love the fact that he's destroying American democracy, destroying American credibility, messing up with our allies, leaving the field on climate change and other issues to China. He's doing a good job of making China great again. So I'm not,
and Russia.
And Russia. So I'm not so sure. So both their ambivalence about who they want to win and the possible blowback if we can uncover evidence, I'm not so sure they're going to do it. But they certainly can, and it won't be a matter of moral restraint. It'll be a matter of calculated self-interest, as always. Yeah.
Good. You've been very prescient. Thank you.
Bruce Guthrie, you talked about trying to contrast Nixon with the current guy and how he did not use foreign policy and foreign use for political business and whatever needs. In 1968, there had been an issue that Nixon had sent Claire Chennault over to the Paris peace talks to say, don't do a deal with Johnson, you'll get a better deal with me. Johnson considered this to be treasonous, but he didn't actually bring it up, and it wasn't actually revealed for many years afterward. Did staff within the Nixon group know that this had happened, and how did they feel about it?
Well, I'm happy I can say I didn't know. I'm not trying to duck your question. I've never fully gotten to the bottom of this. It doesn't smell right to me, frankly, because it would be treasonous. It would be very comparable to today's issues. If, in fact, Nixon ordered Claire Chennault to go to the South Vietnamese and say, in effect, don't make a deal with Johnson, wait for Nixon. That really would be outrageous. That's the allegation. I think there was something on TV just within the last week. I honestly don't know the exact, and I'm not ducking this, I just haven't figured it out, and I've never gotten a straight answer. I've never, frankly, discussed it at length with Kissinger. I should. But my impression is that Chennault was a real self-promoter. So if you made me guess, I'm not saying Nixon wasn't capable of dirty deeds, and certainly Kissinger wouldn't have done this. But it's possible that Nixon saw Chennault, they discussed Vietnam, and being a self-promoter, she invoked Nixon's authority for what she was saying. I mean, she might have said, you ought to wait for Nixon, you get a better deal, and sort of implied Nixon was telling her to say that. I can't say that's true, but that's my best, as I've thought about this issue, because I think it's very tawdry by appearances, that's my best guess, is that she embellished her conversations with Nixon, and therefore you have this appearance of interference. So that's the best I can do, but I would agree with you. If it's absolutely true, and if in effect Nixon said to her, go do this, it would be outrageous.
Lady there, right there.
Ambassador, I'm a reporter from Shenzhen Media Group. So, with the escalation of the US-China trade tension and spread to other fields like technology and even education, but do you think could this actually be an opportunity for China to promote its image with all its attention on it on the international stage? Do you think China is ready for that?
I'm afraid, again, I had trouble hearing.
Me too.
Okay, so with the escalation of U.S.-China trade tension
Right.
and spread to other fields like technology and even education, do you think could this competition dynamic could actually be an opportunity for China to promote its image in the international stage? Do you think China is ready for that?
Well, if you mean China promoting its interest on the international stage, there's no question they put a lot of effort recently into what we would call soft power, of trying to improve its image, is the kind of thing you're getting at. And they've made a tremendous effort, including influencing other countries and societies in ways that are unacceptable. I won't get into detail now. But they haven't been very successful, because you can sell China and Chinese history and culture. And God knows I'm a tremendous admirer of that. You cannot sell their political system. You cannot sell ethnic cleansing. You cannot sell locking up 1 million people. You cannot sell crushing dissent. So they're never going to succeed, in my view, no matter what they try, with that system. Now, they certainly can influence whether it's airlines or hotels or National Basketball Association leads or Hollywood movies with their economic clout. But they're not going to do it through projecting a better image, in my opinion. Now, having said that, I want to make very clear, I'm being tough on China, but I want good relations, and I think it's important that we maintain as many non-governmental exchanges, think tanks, send Chung Li to China every couple of months, and cultural and other exchanges, and above all, welcome Chinese students, welcome Chinese scientists. There's some reason for concern about some theft of technology or using Chinese students as weapons and so on. We do have to pay some attention to that, but we shouldn't overreact. China's overreached, but we shouldn't overreact. We ought to be very selective and careful and try to maintain these personal, non-official bonds as best we can as a buffer so that the whole relationship doesn't go down the tubes.
The gentleman there on the edge. That.
Hi, Carl Gollivan. Thank you for your patience with what might be a provocative question. I'm a retired special agent.
You haven't seen my patience yet. So.
Retired special agent, U.S. Customs, and my question pertains to the global opium trade. Of course, Hong Kong was controlled for 150 years as a free port by the British as a result of prevailing in the opium wars in the mid-1800s, and that's largely forgotten today. But some say even that the Vietnam conflict, the opium trade out of the Golden Triangle was relevant from the U.S. perspective. And even today, it's said that U.S. troops have protected poppy fields in Afghanistan, and the opium trade out of Afghanistan is apparently flourishing, where in 2001 it had almost ceased. So can you comment on the history, especially with respect to China and Hong Kong, of the opium trade, and who controls that in today's world?
Well, I can give a short answer because I don't have an answer. I just don't know anything about this subject except the general impressions in the opium war. So I mean, I'm not going to bluff with false knowledge here. I don't know who controls it. Obviously, gangs control it. I know that we have a real problem with China and fentanyl, and that the imports there, which is a similar problem. And there have been areas like Afghanistan where we've made trade-offs of economic sustainability versus the drug trade, which maybe were ugly. But beyond the general comments like that, I really can't answer your question. I'm sorry, I'm just going to be honest.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yang with Xinhua News. I'll just ask a question about today, as you must be following the Chinese vice premier is in town today. And even though talks haven't really concluded yet, but in a pair of tweets this morning, the president seems to be fairly optimistic about this round of talks. So my question is, if the two sides were to reach some kind of a deal, some say mini deal, what do you think would be the short-term impact for bilateral relationships? Thank you.
If they reach an interim deal, it would be a very modest one. I think would help the relationship from deteriorating further for the short term. It's not going to solve any of the problems, either economic or political. even as we speak, they may be deciding. I just have no idea how it's coming out. Obviously, Trump's calculation is the following: which is better for me to get reelected? It's got nothing to do with the national interest. It's just a matter of how can he get reelected. So if he thinks a modest deal, restrained from putting on more tariffs in exchange for buying more soybeans and maybe some gestures in intellectual property rights that we've seen for 40 years, by the way, if he thinks that it's good for the economy and good for getting him reelected, he'll go that direction. And he'll probably call it the greatest deal since the Magna Carta. If, however, he thinks that'll make him look weak and the anti-Chinese forces will go after him and the economic forces, and it'll look like he was weak, then he may not. He's going to watch the stock market, so he figures a mini deal will help the stock market. I suspect that might be the tipping point. It really is a matter of election calculation. It's got absolutely nothing to do with what's in our interest. So I can't tell you how it's going to come out because he's probably conflicted, which is going to help him more or hurt him less. But to answer your question, I think realistically at this point, all you can do is a mini deal and keep on the agenda the real problems, which to the Trump administration's credit, they've identified. The real problems are not balance of trade, although when you have a $450 billion deficit, you know, over $1 billion a day, that gets to be real money, you know. But the point is that you all know the arguments about exports and imports, and it's not one all bad, none all good. And the real problem is forced technology transfer, intellectual property threats, cyber warfare, subsidies, breaking WTO rules. These are the key issues. There's no way they're going to be solved this week, so they're going to have to put them on the agenda to look at. So they'll probably kick the can down the road. But I don't know, the whole thing may fall apart. My instinct, if you made me bet right now, is they'll come out with a very thin deal and say we're still going to go after these issues seriously, and that Trump will make it a tremendous breakthrough.
Right over here, please.
Good to see you, Winston. Talk to us a bit about your thinking regarding Hong Kong.
Sure.
Major issue, I don't need to elaborate on that. And is there any solution possible? And if not, is this going to be a continuing traumatic situation for the West?
Well, one thing we can say as a result of Hong Kong, one country, two systems is dead if it is ever alive. The incumbent in Taiwan will get reelected, and Hong Kong will never be the same again financially as a past point. So that's already happened, it seems to me. The Chinese have managed to reelect the person they don't want to lead Taiwan. Having said that, I have no idea. Anybody who tells you how it's going to come out, I don't believe them, because nobody knows how it's going to come out. There's good news and there's bad news. The good news is it shows that the yearning for democracy, and it's not just about democracy, I understand, but there are other issues, housing and so on, is not dead in the world. We've had a bad 10 years in terms of autocrats and populists and nationalists taking over and democracy on the retreat. This is the most hopeful demonstration in the other direction, together with some snippets in the Soviet Union. You may want to comment, or Russia, whatever they call it these days, and some other areas that are happening. So there may be some pushback. And so they have a right, because the extradition bill really was the tipping point. I won't go into detail now. We don't have time. I want to get more questions. If you ask me how it's going to come out, the answer, of course, is no. But if you want my best bet, and this is what the Chinese would hope, I think, is that they'll wear this thing out. Now, the umbrella movement lasted for a while, and they got worn out. This one's really had staying power. It's extraordinary in terms of demonstrations. But I think the Chinese feel that, first of all, of course, they've totally misled their own people, so they whipped up nationalism on this thing. They're playing up acts of violence, and there have been some, and it's not good, either morally or as a tactic. They'll work on the tycoons and their interests. They'll continue to lock up leaders. And they might even suggest to Carrie Lam, throw a couple of crumbs out there, not anything basic, but some trumped up, excuse the pun, inquiry on police or some gesture, and hope the combination of peeling off some of the protesters, the pressures financially, the tycoons and so on, the acts of violence, that this thing will finally wear itself out. I'm not saying that's going to happen. If you make me bet, that would be my bet. The bad news is it could end tragically, of course. I don't think the Chinese have any desire to go in there. They want, obviously. Although, frankly, they wouldn't pay a big price. Trump would probably say, well, it's too bad, but so you went in there and crushed everybody. He wouldn't give a damn. And the Chinese didn't really pay too much of a price after Tiananmen. It's very temporary. So if it push comes to shove, they're not going to let Hong Kong drift away, that's for sure. But I don't think they have to, and I certainly don't think they don't want to. So that's my best guess. I can't make a firm prediction.
Yes, sir. You can take the mic and, no, all right, and then give it to the person behind you afterwards.
Absolutely. Good afternoon. My name is Julian Kyle Lewis from the American University here in Washington. Ambassador, you spoke on the speeches that you wrote on behalf of Henry Kissinger. And what I would like to know is, could you talk about like your creative process of just you sitting down at the table, drafting documents that, and if you think about it, it's not like you're writing for the president. You're writing for a diplomat who would eventually transcend administrations. So did you know the ramifications of your words as you were putting them down on the page, that they would be remembered forever and ever? And like, could you go into the creative process of how you felt? What did you feel like? What was your inspiration?
Well, it's an interesting question. To those who can't hear, but what did it feel like to write for Henry and words that presumably had lasting significance? First, I don't want to exaggerate my role. These really were his speeches. I'll give you a sense of the process, but I don't want to exaggerate my role in this by any means. Secondly, when I got to the State Department under the Ford administration, I had two terrific speechwriters working for me in the policy planning staff. And I was sort of orchestra director, but they were the first violins. I mean, they really did the hard work, and I would help them edit and give some advice. The basic process would be a little bit the way I've already described it, but essentially he would say, here's what I want to talk about. So he would outline already the basic themes of the speech and the structure. He took speeches very seriously because even if U.S. press wouldn't pay that much attention, the congressional committees would, but above all, foreign embassies would. So he could set strategic directions and set signals around the world about American policy. Secondly, he saw them as deadline producers. For example, he gave a major speech. Moynihan gave it on his behalf because we were in the Middle East on a shuttle. We were shuttling with Egypt and writing a huge speech at the same time. It was one of the more exhausting moments of my life. But for that speech, he wanted to make a series of initiatives for the developing world, which took economic steps by the Treasury and Commerce Department, and a lot of those were being resisted. So by having a deadline of a UN speech, he could force bureaucratic decisions and presidential decisions up against that deadline when he couldn't get it done before. So he took speeches very seriously. Most secretaries of state don't. And I think he also took it very seriously in his last couple of years at post-Watergate, setting forth the agenda of coming issues and framing it for future administration. So I think he had a sense of the significance of it. I certainly did, writing for the top diplomat at the time, but I didn't, first of all, I don't want to exaggerate my role, and secondly, I didn't think of the cosmic dimensions over many decades. And even his speeches aren't necessarily remembered today, but some of them are pretty damn good. We'd have a good tactic on his speeches, particularly when I was in the State Department. I told my poor guys who were doing the basic draftings that don't get discouraged. He's going to treat you like the anecdote I told earlier. And he'll literally throw the speech on the floor and say it's nonsense. I said, he's going to do that, so get ready for that. But keep your best pages in your paragraphs. Don't throw them away. About the fourth or fifth draft, we'll put them back in again. And we literally would do that, and by then he would like it. You know, he thought it was brilliant. But these were his speeches. First, the intellectual cement, the inspiration, the objective, and the way he'd lay out the bold outlines, then how he would restructure it in the early drafts, and then in the final drafts, he literally is doing line by line. The guy is a brilliant writer, I think if he'd never been a diplomat, just his books would make him a major figure in American diplomacy and history.
Yes, sir.
Matt Delsner, University of Maryland. Staying 50 years ago. What? It's not working? Okay, is that working now? Yeah. In the public mind at the time, and I think since, Kissinger has gotten the predominant credit to some degree at the expense of Nixon for the opening to China. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, in the first, say, 2 years, what the relative roles were. Obviously, at the end, they were reinforcing toward opening to China, but who was pushing what the...
the question is essentially credit between Nixon and Kissinger on the opening of China. I'd apply that more generally to foreign policy. And Kissinger, with great sincerity, by the way, he's got a tremendous ego, I know that. But you look at his memoirs and you look in this book, he's constantly telling you how Nixon was crucial, both the strategic direction which they shared, but his laying out, the courage to make tough decisions. Going to China was not inevitable. I mean, that it was not going to be very controversial, or going into the Middle East, or ending the Vietnam War, or bombing North Vietnam just before a Moscow summit. A lot of decisions took a lot of courage, and they were only presidential decisions that could be made. So both in terms of strategy and courage, he gives full credit to Nixon, including on China and specific issues. They were a perfect fit because Nixon had the strategy, he cared about the general tactics, and we would write memos, and I'd help Henry in this, saying what we plan to do and why, but he would approve it. But then he would leave the details to Kissinger, never second guess him. When we were in October 71, but setting up the Nixon trip, after the secret trip, but a public trip, the Chinese completely switched strategies on a communique with us. I don't have time to go into detail, but it meant revising our whole approach of how we were going to describe the presidential visit. We had no way of communicating with the White House in those days, but Kissinger had enough confidence that Nixon would back him up that he agreed to the Chinese approach, which was the Shanghai communique, basically each side citing their differences instead of the usual kumbaya type of communique. And so that's an example of how he would back him. And Kissinger gives him full credit for all that. Now, specifically on the China opening, as I said earlier, they both wanted to do it with slightly different emphasis. Nixon had written the Foreign Affairs article about global order and keeping China as part of it and having stability. Kissinger balance of power with the Soviets, but they both saw the arguments in the other direction. So if you force me and force Kissinger to say who deserves the most credit, you got to give it to Nixon. He had the political courage to do it. But of course, Kissinger was brilliant in the way he carried it out. And as I mentioned, Nixon sent a memo to Kissinger February 1st, 1969, get in touch with the Chinese. Now, obviously, Kissinger deserves a lot of credit for the way we set public signals to condition publics and the way we got in touch with, through various countries with the Chinese, and then his negotiating on behalf of Nixon when we got there. So they both deserve credit, and you're right, sometimes people tend to give Kissinger more credit. I'm not sure that's true, though. But even the fiercest critics of Nixon usually cite the China opening as, well, even this son of a bitch did this thing right, right? But he got this one right, which I think is unfair, because I think you look at the Middle East and Détente and some other issues and domestic policy.
Arms control?
Arms control, yeah. That's, I could say Détente, I should throw in arms control more specifically. He deserves a lot of credit for other things besides that, even as he gets hit for Watergate.
Thank you.
Yes. Lady here.
Kay Oshel, I'm a retired Department of Labor employee. Ambassador Lord, if a Democrat wins the next election, what's the most important thing that the new president should do, or things, to try to correct America's position?
The most important, and it's, who knows whether it's possible, is to bring this country together again. I mean, that underlies everything. We're now, and these are all cliches, but they have the virtue of being accurate, we're retreating into two camps. we're living in bubbles. The divisiveness and the rhetoric and the distrust, nothing can get done. Democracy's getting a terrible name. We don't even know what truth is anymore, and fake news. Our institutions are eroding. So obviously, whether it's foreign policy or domestic policy, where it all starts, somehow we've got to somehow become a functioning democracy again, both for the health of our country and as an example to the world. So that's a general exhortation, but everything else flows from it, whether we can get the kind of investment in our future that we need, the legislation we need, whether we can restore our civil liberties, whether we can ease racial tensions, whether we can fix and get back to immigration, which helps this country, not hurts it, and is getting destroyed, whether we can have some faith in the news media. It's going to take incredible effort, and we have a terrible legacy to overcome, but that's clearly what we got to do.
Yes. There, down here. Or just, Mike.
I wanted to ask about Kissinger and the bombing of Cambodia.
Right.
I think, what little I know, that brought him down in estimations.
Sure.
And what was your opinion?
It's a very fair question. There's a lot of issues that are controversial, as it would be in any series of issues like we were dealing with. The bombing of Cambodia, as you may recall, took place secretly, with only a few people in the government and Congress knowing about it. And so the issues is, should we have done it, and should it have been kept secret? I was somewhat on the dovish side in most of the Vietnam debates, having said that, but I understood the Cambodian bombing. Let's recall the following. The North Vietnamese had violated Cambodian and Laos sovereignty for years. For example, in Cambodia, they're sitting there 30 miles from Saigon in safe bases in Cambodia, going in, killing Americans and Vietnamese, and then retreating back over the border. So in terms of whether it's the Cambodian incursion later or the bombing, which you're referring to, trying to do something about these bases and North Vietnamese invasion of another country, it seemed to me an ethical and legal grounds was justified. So I had no problem with our bombing those, because Sihanouk, who was the head of the country at that point, approved of it. So we were doing it. We weren't violating sovereignty. The North Vietnamese were, and we had the approval of the leader of the country. And that is why it was kept secret. He didn't mind us doing it because they were threatening his sovereignty, but it would be too embarrassing for him if it was public. So we kept it secret for Sihanouk's case. Now, could we have let a few more senators know and so on, and would every legal scholar agree with the argument? I'm not sure about that, but I do think the basic arguments of who ruined sovereignty first in Cambodia and why you had to keep it secret are pretty persuasive.
To that gentleman, yes.
Thank you. What was Kissinger's role during the October '73 war between the Arabs and Israel?
I'm afraid I can't tell you because you have to buy my book to find out. No, seriously, very quickly, it is in the book. When Nixon and Kissinger came in, one of their objectives was to supplant Soviet influence in the Arab world. Soviet arms were essentially dictating diplomacy then, and their objective was to show that only America could get territory back for Egypt and the others. Only America could mediate peace as being a friend of Israel but willing to talk to the Arabs. That the Soviets, being so one-sided, could give them arms, but they would never get any of their political objectives. They needed our help. The situation was not ripe for our trying to do that until October '73. And also Nixon and Kissinger had their hands filled with Vietnam, China, Russia, and so on, so that they couldn't take that on at the same time, and the situation wasn't ripe. So Secretary of State Rogers was given that portfolio, but it couldn't go anywhere. When the Egyptians attacked in October '73, they made major inroads against Israel for the first time. Israel counterattacked and had surrounded the Egyptian 8th Army. Nixon and Kissinger decided, let's freeze that situation before that army is destroyed. they sent Kissinger, and I was with him, to Moscow to get an immediate ceasefire before the Egyptian army was wiped out. What were Nixon and Kissinger thinking? For the first time, both sides were ready to negotiate. Because for the first time, Israel was sobered up by the military defeats it had incurred with the Egyptian invasion. And so they realized, maybe they need something beyond just military power to preserve their security. And for the first time, the Arabs were totally humiliated, being like the '67 war and so on, that they had managed to at least inflict some initial casualties on the Israelis. And so before the Israelis could once again humiliate the Arabs and wipe out the army, we went to Moscow, and with Moscow's help, we got a ceasefire in place. Once that happened, we then moved on to the first shuttle, returning some territory to Egypt. So that was his role. It was obviously central, and it is laid out in the book.
Hi, my name is Marty LeClaire. What's your take on the current situation with the Russian and U.S. Nuclear arsenal? I know it broke down. We pulled out of it. And so could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked Strobe Talbott that question. I believe.
I was very impressed of Wynn's answer to the question when we get out from under Trump. And he was right to put it to our domestic mess and getting it out of the way. But in the two most big global dangers are the destruction of these various agreements and institutions that have helped us not blow ourselves up. And the other one, of course, is climate change.
Thank you. I can't approve of that. We'll go to the next question.
Over here. The lady, and then you can have the gentleman back of her. Here.
Oh, thank you. My name is Jinar. I'm undergrad student here at the GW. Oh, sorry, you can go first. Oh, you sure? Oh, sorry, I'm so sorry on that.
You could do a duet.
Perfect. I'm an undergrad student at George Washington University here, and I'm from China, so it means so much for me to just hear this part of the story because that was my earliest memory on, foreign policies, on diplomacy, and that's kind of got me where I am right now. My question is actually kind of shifting the gear a little bit, so I'm wondering, what would you think the NATO allies going to play in the part of the Americans trying to rebalance Indo-Pacific region when we see Germany struck a deal or with China last month or even with BRI initiatives building, how should the NATO or EU or Europe balance this sort of power dynamic? Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The Europe-China axis is extremely important. China is paying a lot more attention to Europe these days with investment, even, as you say, the Belt and Road Initiative. They are trying to split the unity of the European forces, and not only NATO, but European community on issues like human rights and even trade. I think Europe is as fed up with China's mercantilistic trade policies as the United States. That's why to be picking fights with them, as well as Japan and Canada and so on, it just is not good strategy vis-a-vis China. So in terms of the U.S. aspect, we ought to be lining up the Europeans with us to put pressure on China on issues like trade. But the president is so obsessed with who pays the most for bases, some of which is a legitimate issue, they ought to pay more, but at the expense of NATO solidarity. I do think, despite what's happening in this country, the democratic ideals that tie us to NATO, not just the military situation, means we have nothing to worry about in terms of NATO or Europe lining up with China against us. I think they're still going to be wary of the security aspects, even as they're interested in the economic. And that's true of almost every country in the world. All of Asia doesn't want to choose between us. They want China's economic strength and they want our security umbrella. So I'm not worried about the interaction. I am worried that we're not getting them on our side, whether it's human rights and so on. Now, I think this can be repaired, but under the current administration, it's a serious handicap.
Did you want to have it? Yes. Chung. A mic up here, please.
We still have one microphone here.
Oh, yeah, you want to go ahead? Okay.
You sure?
We've got lots of mics right over here.
So let me ask you first. So first, thank you so much for that very candid and also believe very balanced assessment. And my question is that when we talk about the strategy or negotiation or diplomacy, we also have to look at the some areas we may compromise or may, as you said, to pay attention to China's legitimate national interests.
Right.
So in that regard, in which area, if you suggest to the president and maybe future president or current president, United States should be a little bit more sensitive, because this is an area we probably should be more sensitive from Chinese perspective. We cannot in all fronts just very, very tough on China. So if that's the case, which area we may have do much better job to understand Chinese position and therefore negotiation better, or maybe it's not the right word, compromise, and to a certain extent.
It's a very fair question, because I've given the rationale for a firmer response in certain areas, but I also said the U.S. is not blameless, or that I don't want to put all the blame on China, although I do think they deserve the bulk of it, and also some of it's built in, rising versus established power. I'd answer your question three ways. First, the first is impossible, but ideally you should do it, and I've been promoting this for years, as have others, including Kissinger, a strategic dialogue between our leaders. It can't happen now. I mean, Trump wouldn't know what a strategic dialogue was, and frankly, the Chinese aren't on the level of Zhou Enlai either, so it's hard, but ideally I'd like the two countries, and this is the first part of your question, to have this kind of dialogue. The U.S. would say, and it gets to your question, and mean it, we genuinely welcome your rise, and we welcome the competition. It's going to make us get our own act together, and we're going to compete with you. We're not trying to contain you. We're not trying to keep you down. Secondly, in the Pacific, you have legitimate security concerns because of geography and history. We have so we can both coexist in the Pacific. There's room for both of us. We're not trying to crowd you, but you can't expel us, and countries want both of us. Let's work out a Pacific community together with other countries. Thirdly, on the world stage, with your rising power, you deserve more seats at the table, and so does India and Brazil and a few others. So we welcome your being a, quote, responsible stakeholder, greater influence. You have a right to reforming the system. You do not have a right to overthrow it or to violate long-standing international law and norms. So let's work out a strategic relationship on those bases. The Chinese would say in return, we are a rising power, we deserve it. We're here to share responsibility for the world system, not to replace the United States, even if we could. In Asia, we agree we both have interests, let's coexist, but please keep in mind our legitimate security concerns. And on the world stage, we do want some reforms, but it's benefited us and it's helped us to grow. We recognize that. We're not going to overthrow it. This is all nebulous. It's important. It's impossible right now, but that's the kind of strategic framework I'd like to have. Secondly, you look for areas you can cooperate. And here Trump has destroyed them. The Iran deal, the climate change, these have been destroyed. We still have some areas, anti-piracy, pandemic plagues, drug control, UN peacekeeping. There's some areas where China has been responsible in international governance, So let's work together in those areas where we can cooperate and where the problems probably can't be solved unless we do cooperate, like climate change. Then thirdly, on sensitivities, that is more difficult to define. I'll take one example, but I want to be very careful. I'm not suggesting this. I just don't know enough. We do fly very aggressive oversight reconnaissance flights near Chinese territory. I honestly don't know whether we're required to do that much. They're pretty provocative. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it or cutting it down. I'm just saying that's an area at least I'd like to know more about, whether that is something that we don't have to rattle their cage that much, that what we get out of intelligence isn't worth the provocation. Taiwan, I think we are respecting. I believe in strengthening Taiwan and maintaining strong relationship, and China is squeezing it. But we shouldn't come out for independence and so on. But I think that's one we're already respecting. So there's some areas, but I think it's a three-layer thing. You know, what is our strategic intention? Where can we cooperate? And then within that, where can we maybe find areas we ought to be more sensitive?
Well, this has been really terrific. When I learned some time ago was a opera buff, and this has been a virtuoso performance this afternoon. And we want you to come back sometime maybe in the summer or the fall of next year for another book. It's going to be called Lord on Lord by Lord.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.